Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
This is Lindsay Smith Rogers. Today, how we can make sure food is available even during a crisis. Elsie Moore, a PhD candidate in public health at Johns Hopkins and a researcher at the Center for a Livable Future, is an expert in food system resilience. She joins Dr. Josh Sharfstein to explain this concept and how we can achieve it. A link to the Center for Livable Future's planning guide to improve food system resilience is in our show notes. Let's listen.
Elsie Moore, thank you so much for joining me on Public Health on Call to talk about this concept called food system resiliency. And maybe I'll just start by saying, first of all, what's a food system?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me today. So a food system is really all of the processes that go into producing, transporting, consuming food, and all of the workers that are a part of it, and the many different kind of elements that go from farm to table of an individual food item.
So in other words, things just don't show up in the supermarket.
Exactly, yes.
So what's resiliency in the food system?
So resiliency is a concept that's been used in a lot of different fields. It's been in ecology when thinking about how trees and natural systems are resilient to things. It's been used in medical fields, thinking about individual resiliency and community resiliency. But it's how systems are able to continue to adapt and move forward in the case of various and unforeseen disasters.
So in this case, we're talking about maintaining access to food, right, through our food system, even when there are all kinds of different crises happening.
Yeah, exactly. In our work, we really use a definition that is a food system resiliency, that it's the capacity over time of the food system and the multiple units of the food system to provide sufficient, appropriate, and acceptable food to all, even in the case of these unforeseen disturbances. Or I think about it more simply, it's how do you ensure that people have food even when disruptions continue to happen?
I like that definition. Let's talk about the disruptions for a minute. What are we talking about? We've got weather problems, for example?
Yeah, so there can be natural or kind of human-made disruptions, and then they could either be a shock or a stressor. So a shock being a sudden disturbance to the food system, or a stressor being a more gradual eroding of it. So you could think about climate change and kind of more severe weather events that happen. That might be an immediate shock, or a longer-term drought, changing of kind of natural conditions that are just placing more stress on the food system.
And what about the human-made stressors and shocks? What would those be?
Yeah, so that could be a kind of social disruption that occurs. It could be political unrest. It could be something like inflation within the food system that's rising cost of it and limiting people's economic access to foods.
So the Ukraine war, for example, is having an enormous effect on pressuring the food system globally.
Yeah, exactly. So wars, global disruptions absolutely can impact the food system. And oftentimes they could be far away from the point that a person actually is getting their food at, say, the grocery store or a farmer's market. But the implications of global disruptions really can trickle down to all different levels.
The concept of we need to make sure we can still get food really hit home during the pandemic, when all of a sudden people were talking about essential workers. And it's like, yeah, the people who are actually making it possible for you to eat.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think COVID-19 really highlighted many of the challenges within the food system and the different ways that it can be impacted. Either it could be economic impacts to the food system. It could be actual limited access, which we saw in COVID-19, that people couldn't necessarily get to the grocery store. But it could also be the acceptability of foods in terms of outbreaks that happen. So disruptions can really impact the food system in a lot of different ways. And so resiliency is trying to anticipate those disruptions and then think about ways to prevent them in the future, be more resilient to them.
Got it. Well, you've convinced me there are a lot of potential disruptions, but I know you don't just sit around and wring your hands. You work on improving resiliency, making food systems more capable of handling stress. What does that work entail?
We have worked with local governments on this. As I talked about, resiliency can exist at a lot of different kind of scales. So other people are working at the household level or the individual level. But in our work, we've really focused in on what can local governments do, because they are often the ones who are important emergency food responders in the case of disruptive events. So we've chose to focus on that, but acknowledge there's many other touch points to work on resiliency in the food system.
So we're talking about like city councils, mayors, county councils, county executives, that they need to be thinking about making sure that their food system is resilient.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of kind of local governments in the United States, it could be a Department of Planning, a health department, an Office of Sustainability, partners with different kind of members of the community organizations, universities to think about these disruptions and how they can move forward with it.
All right. So let's say I'm in a city or a county and I'm kind of wondering whether my food system is resilient or able to handle different shocks. What do I look for?
Yeah, so we created a resource working with 5 local governments in the United States. So Denver, Colorado, Moorhead, Minnesota, Austin, Texas, Orlando, Florida, and Baltimore, Maryland, to do exactly the question that you're asking. What are the sorts of things that a jurisdiction may want to consider? So developed a planning guide that can be used by local governments, but also their partners to begin to assess what are the hazards that are going to impact the food system, and then what are some strategies that can be done. So to give you just an example of one of the tools that's a part of this, it's to work together as a team to say, what are these natural disruptions? What are these social disruptions, the human, the natural, the shocks, the stressors that could actually impact a jurisdiction? And then to look at the frequency of the level of impact that they would have on the food system to get a sense of what are the threats to a specific place.
So, for example, Austin, Texas might be looking at heat waves, and Baltimore, Maryland might be looking at hurricanes.
Exactly. Yeah. So different disruptions that can impact different jurisdictions, and thinking about now, but also in the future as well, that we know kind of with changing conditions that the disruptions today may not be the disruptions of the future. So trying to anticipate those, but also the unanticipated disruptions as well. I think many places, even who had thought about this, didn't plan for a pandemic. So what are the things that can raise the overall resiliency, even if you haven't anticipated the exact form of disruption?
So what are things that local governments can do to improve resiliency? I mean, you've got them now framing out their worst nightmares, right? This could happen, that could happen, this probably will happen, that probably will happen. What are the kinds of things that local governments can do to make sure that there's food for people when different challenges happen?
Yeah, well, I think maybe what's helpful is we use kind of these 4 key questions that local governments, but also others can think about in this case too. So the first one is resilience of what? So what are the things or the systems that you're actually trying to make more resilient? So this could be a city that's interested in local food systems or within the city boundary. The second part of it is resilience to what? So what are those natural and human-made disasters that may impact the food system? Then the third one is resilience for what purpose? So what are the goals in building resiliency? So is it to help in emergency response efforts, or is it food system transformation? And then kind of the last question is resilience for whom? So how does resiliency work actually promote equity and justice and make the food system fairer for everyone? So we kind of present this as a starting framework, and then depending on the answers to those questions, it will kind of shape the strategies that an organization or jurisdiction may want to think about.
Got it. So you want people to ask some pretty big questions about the food system, including how well it's serving people today, with the goal of putting in place strategies to make it stronger for a whole bunch of different scenarios.
Exactly. That ultimately, hopefully, strategies that build resiliency are also upending inequitable practices within the food system, or in this space, it's called bouncing back better, that because of what is done for resiliency, you actually have a more equitable and functioning food system by putting these into place.
Can you give me maybe a couple examples of actual strategies to improve resiliency that you've seen be successful?
I think thinking locally, it could be a jurisdiction that may change some of their planning ordinances so that there could be more urban farming that's happening. So more food that's actually grown within a jurisdiction, or having backyard chickens. Maybe those are something that wasn't allowable within a planning space, but changing the actual laws so that more food could be produced in those. Or thinking on a larger scale, say the United States, there's work happening to look at what are the different ways that food is transported across the United States. What are the main trucking routes that are happening? What are the vulnerabilities within that? And do we need to have different routes that are being taken? Does there need to be backups in place, other efficiencies around kind of how food is transported globally and within the United States?
There are a lot of different options. And I imagine that like a city that examines itself and finds that it's hard enough to get fruits and vegetables to particular communities today might say, we need more of a structure and a set of relationships that can improve the pipeline of services so that we're getting more varied foods into the city now, and we can count on that under different stress scenarios.
Yeah, and I think you're pointing to a really important thing. And what we've heard from some of our local government partners is that relationships and relationship building are essential to resiliency work, that knowing who the food partners are within a jurisdiction can really help in the case of an emergency, but also longer term work. So as another example that heard about is actually having someone who works on food be a part of emergency operations in the case of a disaster. So someone there who's tasked with making sure that people get food, and being in that room to kind of represent that voice can be really helpful in making sure that food is available and accessible and appropriate.
Since the pandemic, has this field gained in stature? Are there more cities looking at this? Are they downloading your assessment tool? Are you seeing a movement in this direction? It's obviously hard when the problems are hypothetical to get people to pay attention to it. But given the challenges we've had, do you see momentum?
I think so. Yeah, I think really COVID-19 highlighted a lot of the vulnerabilities within the food system and helped to place importance on planning for them. Food system resilience is a pretty nascent field, but there's a lot of work that's happening within jurisdictions to help to build it. It just maybe hasn't been labeled as such. And so I think part of it is aligning the name and the terminology with work that's already happening, but it definitely is a growing field in a space of more interest.
Well, I will definitely be thinking about this, probably more so when I'm eating. But I appreciate your explaining this concept and all the work that you're doing to make food that we eat more reliable.
Thank you so much for having us and the opportunity to share about the resource.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinale, Philip Porter, Spencer Greer, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Fernandez and Shian Briscoe. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.